It's 1967, deep in the Vietnamese jungle. A squad of American soldiers is pinned down. Enemy fire from all sides. 3 men are bleeding out. No roads, no reinforcements within miles. They're going to die here. Then they hear it. That sound, that beautiful, unmistakable sound. In the hell of Vietnam, that sound meant one thing. You're going home alive. The helicopter didn't just transport troops in Vietnam. It didn't just deliver supplies or evacuate the wounded. It became something else entirely, a lifeline, a guardian angel, a symbol of hope in the most hopeless war. Today we're diving into one of the most incredible stories of military innovation in history, how a single machine, the Huey helicopter, transformed warfare forever, how it saved thousands of lives, and how it became the beating heart of the entire American war effort in Vietnam. This is the story of why helicopters became the lifeline of U.S. troops in Vietnam. Before we understand the helicopter's role, we need to understand the nightmare that was Vietnam's terrain. Picture this. You're a soldier in 1965. You've been dropped into a country that seems designed to kill you. Triple canopy jungles so thick you can't see 10 feet ahead. Trees so tall they block out the sun. Vines that grab your legs. Mud that sucks at your boots. The heat? Over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity at 90%. You're carrying 70 pounds of gear. Your uniform is soaked through with sweat in minutes. But here's the real problem. There are almost no roads. Think about that for a second. In World War II, armies moved on roads. Tanks rolled on highways. Supply trucks followed paved routes. In Vietnam, nothing. The few roads that existed were either bombed out, booby-trapped, or controlled by the enemy. Moving supplies by truck meant driving into certain ambushes. And it wasn't just jungle. Vietnam had everything. Rice paddies that turned into swamps during monsoon season. Mountains that rose thousands of feet. Rivers that flooded without warning. The Viet Cong knew this terrain like the back of their hand. They'd lived there their entire lives. They had tunnel systems, hidden trails, secret supply routes through Laos and Cambodia. The famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of jungle paths, let them move troops and supplies invisibly through the wilderness. American forces? They were fighting blind. Traditional military tactics didn't work here. You couldn't march armies across this terrain. You couldn't set up supply lines. You couldn't even find the enemy most of the time. The U.S. military needed a new solution. They needed a way to move fast, to strike anywhere, to reach soldiers trapped in the middle of nowhere. They needed something that could fly over the jungle, ignore the terrain, and land anywhere. They needed the helicopter. But here's the question. Could a machine that had barely been used in warfare really change everything? Spoiler alert, it absolutely could. Let me introduce you to the most iconic aircraft of the Vietnam War, the Bell UH-1 Iroquois. You probably know it better as the Huey. If you've seen any movie about Vietnam, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Forrest Gump, you've heard this sound. It became the soundtrack of the war. The Huey wasn't the first helicopter. It wasn't even the first used in combat. But it was the first helicopter that could do everything the military needed. Here's what made it special. First, it was fast. Top speed of 120 miles per hour. In the dense jungle, that was lightning. Second, it could carry people, up to 14 troops at once or 6 stretchers with wounded soldiers. Third, it was reliable. Unlike earlier helicopters that broke down constantly, the Huey just worked, even in the brutal Vietnamese heat and humidity. Fourth, it was versatile. You could use it for transport, medical evacuation, supply delivery, or combat. Just swap out the equipment. The U.S. military saw the potential immediately. Between 1962 and 1975, they deployed over 7,000 Hueys to Vietnam. 7,000. That's not a typo. Entire squadrons of Hueys filled the sky. They became as common as Jeeps had been in World War II. But here's what makes this really interesting. Before Vietnam, helicopters were basically experimental. Sure, they'd been used in Korea for medical evacuations, a few dozen here and there, but they were unreliable, slow, and limited. In Vietnam, the U.S. military didn't just use helicopters. They built an entire war strategy around them. Imagine you're a helicopter pilot in 1966. Your day starts before dawn. You pre-flight your Huey, checking every system, every bolt, every inch of metal. Because today, you might fly a dozen missions. You might transport soldiers into a hot landing zone under fire. You might evacuate wounded from a battlefield. You might deliver ammunition to a fire base surrounded by the enemy. And all of that before lunch. The pilots called themselves flying truck drivers. But they were so much more than that. They were the circulatory system of the entire war effort. Without them, the war stops. With them, American forces could be anywhere, anytime. So, how did this actually work in practice? How did helicopters change the way wars were fought? Let's talk about air mobility. Air mobility. Two words that changed warfare forever. Here's the concept in the simplest terms. What if you could move soldiers anywhere, instantly, without roads? Traditional armies were stuck on the ground. They needed roads, railways, supply lines. But helicopters? They didn't need any of that. They could fly over mountains, over jungles, over swamps. They could land in a rice paddy, a jungle clearing, or on top of a mountain. Anywhere flat enough for a helicopter to touch down became a potential landing zone. The U.S. military developed a new kind of warfare, airmobile operations. Here's how it worked. Phase 1. Intelligence scouts or reconnaissance would identify enemy positions. Maybe through aerial photography, maybe through radio intercepts, maybe from Vietnamese informants. Phase 2. Rapid deployment. Instead of marching troops through the jungle for days, helicopters would transport entire companies, sometimes hundreds of soldiers, in minutes. They called it an air assault. Imagine 20 Hueys descending at once, doors open mid-flight, soldiers jumping out before the skids even touch ground, gunfire erupting immediately. It was chaos. It was terrifying. But it worked. Phase 3. Resupply. Once troops were on the ground, they needed ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. Helicopters flew constant resupply missions, sometimes multiple times per hour during heavy fighting. A firebase could be completely isolated, surrounded by enemy territory, but as long as helicopters could reach it, it could hold. Phase 4. Casualty evacuation. This is where helicopters truly became lifelines. The dust-off missions. Medevac helicopters, marked with giant red crosses, would fly into active combat zones to extract wounded soldiers. No soldier left behind. That was the promise. And the numbers prove it worked. In World War II, if you were seriously wounded, you had about a 1 in 4 chance of survival. In Vietnam, thanks to helicopter medevacs, 1 in 100 wounded soldiers died. Read that again. 1 in 100. Helicopters cut the average evacuation time from hours, sometimes days, to under an hour. The golden hour became a medical reality. Get a wounded soldier to a field hospital within 60 minutes, and their survival rate skyrockets. Imagine being a soldier bleeding out in the jungle. You hear the Huey coming, you see it land. Medics jump out, load you onto a stretcher, and within minutes, you're in the air. That sound, the helicopter, meant you were going to live. But who were these pilots? These men flying into hell to save lives? Let's meet some of them. This is Major Patrick Brady. January 6, 1968. Brady is flying a medevac mission near Chu Lai. The weather is horrific. Monsoon rains, zero visibility, thick fog. He gets the call. Wounded soldiers need immediate evacuation. Any sane pilot would refuse. The conditions are impossible. Brady flies anyway. He can't see more than a few feet ahead. He's navigating by following dirt roads through breaks in the fog. One wrong move, and he crashes into a mountain. He lands, loads the wounded, takes off. Then he does it again. And again, and again. That day, Brady flew 3 separate rescue missions in conditions that should have killed him. He saved 51 wounded soldiers. For his actions, he received the Medal of Honor. But here's the thing. Brady wasn't unique. Helicopter pilots did this kind of thing every single day. Warrant Officer Michael Novosel, Captain Ed Freeman, Major Bruce Crandall. These weren't career military officers with decades of experience. Most helicopter pilots were in their early 20s. Think about that. 22 years old, flying into combat zones, making life or death. decisions multiple times a day. And it was incredibly dangerous. Over 5,000 helicopters were shot down or destroyed during the Vietnam War. Pilots had some of the highest casualty rates of any role in the military. Listen to this. Dust off 9-3, we have 4 urgent. Enemy contact heavy. LZ is hot. Repeat, LZ is hot. Roger, we're inbound. Pop smoke. Hot LZ meant landing while under fire. Pilots did it anyway. They'd come in fast, flare at the last second, touchdown just long enough for wounded to be loaded, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes less, then pull pitch and get out. All while bullets tore through the thin aluminum skin of the helicopter. Here's one story that captures it perfectly. November 1965, the Drang Valley, the first major battle between U.S. and North Vietnamese forces. American troops are surrounded, taking heavy casualties. They're cut off from reinforcements. Major Bruce Crandall, callsign Ancient Serpent 6, is flying a Huey. He makes 22 flights into the hot LZ that day. 22 times he lands under fire to deliver ammunition and evacuate wounded. On one flight, a bullet rips through his windshield, missing his head by inches. He keeps flying. By the end of the day, Crandall has delivered tons of ammunition and evacuated more than 70 wounded soldiers. He later said, "You don't leave people behind. That's not negotiable." He received the Medal of Honor for that day. But ask any soldier who fought in Vietnam what the Medal of Honor really represents. It represents the thousands of helicopter pilots who did the same thing, day after day, whose names we'll never know. But helicopters weren't just for transport and rescue. They were also weapons, devastating weapons. Meet the Huey gunship. Take a regular transport Huey. Now add M60 machine guns mounted on each side, rocket pods carrying 2.75-inch rockets, sometimes a minigun capable of firing 4,000 rounds per minute. You've just created a flying weapons platform that changed the nature of combat. That sound, that's a minigun. When that thing opens up, it sounds like a buzzsaw tearing through metal. Because that's basically what it is. Gunships provided close air support in ways that had never been possible before. Traditional close air support meant calling in fighter jets or bombers. That took time, sometimes 30 minutes or more, and jets moved too fast to accurately hit targets near friendly troops. Gunships were already there. They flew alongside transport helicopters, protecting them during insertions and extractions. When troops landed, gunships would prep the LZ, circle the landing zone, and suppress enemy fire with rockets and machine guns. Picture the tactic. The pink team. One small, fast scout helicopter, usually an OH-6 Loach, would fly low and slow over suspected enemy positions, deliberately drawing fire. Why? To find the enemy. And hovering high above, a gunship, waiting. The second the enemy opens fire on the scout helicopter, the gunship dives and unleashes hell. It was dangerous, it was aggressive, it was effective. Gunships could respond to contact within minutes. They could stay on station for hours. They could hit targets with precision that jets couldn't match. But here's the psychological element. Imagine being a Viet Cong soldier. You've been hiding in the jungle. You ambush American troops. You think you have the advantage. Then you hear them. Not one helicopter, not two, a dozen. 2 dozen. They're coming from everywhere. Gunships circling like predators. The air fills with the sound of rotors and gunfire. You can't hide from them. You can't shoot them all down. You can't escape fast enough. That's terror. Years later, North Vietnamese veterans admitted the helicopters were one of the most psychologically devastating weapons America used. The constant presence, the noise, the feeling that the enemy could appear anywhere, anytime, and you couldn't stop them. But it cut both ways, because for American soldiers, helicopters meant something completely different. Let's talk about what the helicopter meant to the people who fought this war. For American soldiers, you're exhausted. You've been on patrol for days in the jungle. You're cut off from base. You're low on ammunition and food. Your buddy just stepped on a mine. You're scared. You're alone. Then you hear it. That sound. Instant relief. Instant hope. The helicopter meant reinforcements are coming. Supplies are coming. If you get hit, you're going home. Soldiers developed an almost religious attachment to helicopters. They'd kiss the skids after a rescue. They'd write letters home describing the pilots as guardian angels. The Huey became a symbol of survival. That distinctive wop 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 meant you were going to make it. But there was a flip side. The helicopter also meant you were about to go into combat. Imagine sitting in a Huey with a dozen other soldiers, doors open, wind screaming past, jungle below. You know in 5 minutes you're landing in a hot zone. Your heart is pounding, your hands are shaking. The guy next to you is throwing up. The helicopter touches down. Go, go, go! You jump out. Immediately gunfire, chaos. The helicopter lifts off behind you and suddenly you're alone on the ground. For many soldiers, the sound of helicopters became permanently linked to trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. Decades after the war, veterans would hear a helicopter and immediately experience flashbacks, panic attacks. The sound brought them right back to Vietnam. It's a reminder that these machines weren't just tools, they were witnesses to horror, to loss, to fear for the enemy. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong developed their own tactics to counter helicopters. They'd set up anti-aircraft positions around likely landing zones. They'd wait until helicopters were most vulnerable, coming in to land, hovering to load wounded, then open fire with everything they had. Shooting down a helicopter became a major victory, proof that the Americans weren't invincible. But the psychological impact remained. The Americans could be anywhere. Traditional guerrilla tactics relied on knowing your enemy's movements, on setting ambushes, on disappearing before reinforcements arrived. Helicopters made that almost impossible. So, beyond the individual stories, beyond the psychological impact, what did helicopters actually achieve strategically? How did they change warfare itself? Let's zoom out and look at the big picture. Before Vietnam, wars were won by controlling territory. You captured cities, you held ground, you built supply lines. Vietnam shattered that model. The enemy didn't hold territory. They hid in the jungle. They struck and disappeared. They used tunnels and trails you couldn't find. Traditional tactics didn't work. Helicopters gave the U.S. military a new approach. Don't control the territory. Control the airspace. With helicopters, you didn't need to hold the ground. You could strike anywhere, withdraw quickly, resupply remotely, evacuate casualties instantly. You could fight a mobile war in an immobile environment. Consider this. In World War II, it could take weeks to move troops and supplies to the front lines. In Vietnam, helicopters could move an entire battalion in hours. The First Cavalry Division Airmobile perfected this concept. They were the first division built entirely around helicopter warfare. Every soldier expected to fight from helicopters. Every tactic assumed air mobility. In major operations like Operation Junction City and Operation Pegasus, thousands of troops were deployed by helicopter in massive coordinated air assaults. It was warfare on a scale never seen before. But here's the crucial question. Did it work? The answer is complicated. Tactically, absolutely. Helicopters gave U.S. forces incredible mobility and firepower. They saved thousands of lives. They won countless battles. Strategically, that's harder to say. The U.S. didn't win the Vietnam War, despite helicopters, despite air mobility, despite all the technological advantages. Why? Because you can't win a guerrilla war with mobility alone. The North Vietnamese understood this. They couldn't match American air power. They couldn't win conventional battles. So they didn't try. They fought a war of attrition. They waited. They endured. They knew the Americans would eventually leave. But, and this is important, helicopters changed warfare forever, regardless of Vietnam's outcome. Every modern military learned from Vietnam. Air mobility became a cornerstone of military doctrine worldwide. The tactics developed in Vietnam, air assault, rapid deployment, medevac under fire, are still used today. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in conflicts around the globe, helicopters remain essential. The Huey's descendants, the Black Hawk, the Apache, the Chinook, carry on the legacy. And it all started in the jungles of Vietnam. So, why did helicopters become the lifeline of U.S. troops in Vietnam? Because Vietnam demanded it. The terrain, the enemy, the type of war. Everything about Vietnam required a new kind of warfare. Helicopters provided mobility in an immobile environment, speed where speed was impossible, hope where hope was scarce. For the soldiers who fought there, the helicopter wasn't just a machine. It was survival. It was the sound of someone coming to save you. It was the promise that you weren't alone. For the pilots who flew them, it was a calling, day after day flying into danger to bring soldiers home. Thousands of pilots, thousands of missions, thousands of lives saved. By the end of the war, 36 million helicopter flight hours over Vietnam, over 7 million troops transported, 900,000 wounded evacuated, 900,000. Nearly 1 million people who lived because a helicopter reached them in time. Today, Hueys sit in museums. They're relics of a different era, but their impact, that's still being felt. Every time a helicopter evacuates wounded from a battlefield, every time troops deploy by air to a crisis zone, every time someone's life is saved because help arrived from the sky, that's the legacy of the Huey. That's the legacy of Vietnam. In the hell of the Vietnam jungle, where nothing made sense and everything was uncertain, one thing remained constant. That sound, the sound of hope, the sound of home, the sound of the lifeline. If you found this story powerful, imagine what else we don't know about the history of warfare, the innovations born from desperation, the heroes whose names we've forgotten. Hit that subscribe button to join us as we uncover more untold stories of military history. What should we cover next? Leave a comment below. And if you know a veteran, especially a helicopter pilot or crew member from Vietnam, thank them. Their story deserves to be heard. Thanks for watching,